And so my topic today is accidents on the walking road, or a media archaeology of the moving walkway. And as you will see quite soon, this has to do with one of my research interests, which is the idea about mobility in relation to media. And I'm going to talk about a phenomenon today that all of you know and all of you have tried, but possibly not from exactly this kind of angle from which I'm dealing with this topic. And I guess that every topic has a starting point, and my lecture begins today, just a few weeks ago when I was in the city of Paris, changing subway lines at the station of Montparnasse, and took this really long moving walkway. And when I was done, I turned back and took these snapshots. I don't think that many people even take snapshots of these things anymore, because they are so much part of our everyday lives. So it is sort of like a form of invisible technology. Technology we use, but we don't pay much attention at all. But basically in this lecture I am trying to make this technology visible again, and trying to ask, where did this idea come from, how did it evolve, and what kind of imaginary visions both influenced it and to what kind of visions it gave rise to. And this trip takes us back about 150 years. Finally, hopefully we'll get right to the present. But first of all, let me show you two quotations that lie in the sort of like beginning of my research. Here's a quotation from satirical author Gaston Bergeret from 1901. He said, "Autrefois, c'était l'homme qui marchait sur le chemin. Nous avons si bien dompté la matière que maintenant c'est le chemin qui marche sur l'homme." Well, if your French is not perfect, here's a translation. In old times, the humans used to walk on roads. We have mastered this thing so perfectly that today it is the road that walks under humans. This is another, just a year before. Les fleuves, disait Pascal, sont des chemins qui marchent. Les curieux qui viennent visiter l'exposition y découvrent un chemin qui marche et qui n'est pas un fleuve. Pascal once said that rivers are roads that walk. Curious visitors will discover at the Universal Exposition a road that walks, but is not a river. And so we are talking about the Paris Universal Exposition of 1900, one of the most famous and greatest of the so-called World's Fairs that has been organized. And the thing, that walking road that was referred to, was known as trottoir roulant. And you see a glimpse of trottoir roulant in 1900 here. It was also known by another name called la plateforme mobile. So in a way, the mobile platform, and connected with le chemin de fer électrique, the electric railway. Here you see a few ladies traveling on the so-called trottoir roulant, and by the time we get to the end of this presentation, you will have seen many more of them. Here's a stereoscopic postcard showing a couple of guys standing while moving on that platform. Thomas Edison, who was one of the pioneers of cinema, we lived during the earliest years of cinema as a medium in 1900, sent one of his cameramen, James White, to the Paris World Exposition. And one of the topics he was very keen on documenting was trottoir roulant. And fortunately, we have few of his films still left. This is what James White shot on the trottoir roulant on August 9, 1900. It's a silent film. As you see in this film, James White placed his camera on the moving platform of that walkway. So in a way, traveling together with the walkway, and this is actually one of the first instances of using this kind of a mobile traveling camera shot that we are familiar with. You may already want to pay attention to these sticks that you see traveling with the walkway. I'll explain you everything, but you see some sticks here as the walkway reaches Champ de Mars by the main part of the exhibition, and people get off. He then changed the position of the camera on the moving walkway and shot some other scenes along the route of that walkway that I will explain you in a second. So this thing that you just witnessed here in this documentation was generally considered to be one of the clues, the most important and most fascinating aspects of that huge exposition. To understand its meaning and importance, we have to look at the map of the exposition. So some of you probably have been to the city of Paris, and everybody recognizes the landmark of the previous exposition of the 1889, the Eiffel Tower. This is the left bank and this is the right bank, and right here we have Place de la Concorde that many of you probably know, and the River Seine. The exposition's main gate was on the right bank, from which, through this park, people would supposed to visit these two big exposition halls called the Petit Palais and the Grand Palais. Then crossing the new bridge Alexandre III and reaching the first part of the exposition around the Les Invalides, Boulevard des Invalides, right? These palaces right here. There were also exposition pavilions by the river, on both river banks, including the very famous Albert Robidas' Le Vieux Paris right here on the right bank. There was another concentration of colonial exhibits around the Trocadero on the other side of the Eiffel Tower, and the national pavilions, most of them by the river on the left bank. And then the other huge concentration would be found on the Champ de Mars behind Eiffel Tower, right here. So what this shows you is that the exposition was brought into the city itself in this case. And that means that huge parts of the city where people lived and worked and spent their normal lives was left between these concentrations of the exposition. And that is one of the explanations for the idea of building Le Trottoir Roulant. There were many plans and fantasies, and this chocolate trade card, which was issued before the actual exposition was ready to be opened, actually imagined that this new line, Trottoir Roulant, would actually circle around the Eiffel Tower and the whole Champ de Mars. But this was not the way it came to be. This map, part of the map of the exposition, shows you the actual route of the Trottoir Roulant. So in the previous one, we looked at the view from the point of view of the the main gate right here, Petit Palais, Grand Palais, Trocadero, and Eiffel Tower. So we see it from a different angle. Let's have a look at another map. This map here shows the Esplanade des Invalides, Champ de Mars, and between these areas we see the route of the trottoir roulant, the traveling medium of the future that was introduced for enthusiastic crowds in Paris 1900. Pay attention to this building right here. This was the so-called Galerie des Machines, dedicated for technological exhibits, and this is of course the Eiffel Tower. In this view, you see Galerie des Machines and the track of the trottoir roulant passing it by. And you can also pay attention to the fact that just inside, but on a separate platform, we see an electric railway car actually moving to the opposite direction. Here I have turned to face the other direction and see those ladies traveling on the platform and another train arriving, sort of like traveling towards me. So we have virtually visited this corner right here, showing how the trottoir roulant passes by the exhibition area along the Avenue de la Bourdonnais, turns here towards Avenue de la Motte-Piquet, and finally towards to that side of the Invalides before it turns back to the river and continues its circling of the exhibition area. So what was this thing? Trottoir roulant, as we have seen, was a moving platform. It was designed by three French inventors whose name were Blanc, Guianet, and de Maucomble. What was special and interesting about this system was that it actually consists of three different platforms that you have already maybe seen in the Edison film. There was a static platform which was on slightly lower level than the others. There was a slow-moving platform and a fast platform. And the idea here would be that people would be, so to say, jumping between these platforms according to their needs. If you wanted to concentrate on something, to seeing something from the platform, you would just jump on the stationary platform, or you could then travel to a destination by choosing the one that would travel about 2 meters per 1 second. So the one in the middle about 1 meter per second. This system was powered by alternate current, 172 electric motors that were distributed along a route which was over 3 kilometers long altogether. I'm terrible with miles, so please excuse me for being too European for a moment. So. And according to this system, if you just stepped on the fast platform, it would take about 25 minutes just standing sort of like and circling this part of the city of Paris. And as you already see, next to the platform there was an electric railway traveling to the opposite direction. Both were run by the same stock company called Compagnie de Transport Électrique de l'Exposition. This picture just shows you the basic structure. So the slow-moving platform was mostly meant to facilitate switching from the stationary platform to the main platform, which was the fast platform. To make it even easier, on both platforms there were these kind of sticks that you could grasp while you were doing the jumping. You will see quite soon how that led to interesting sort of like consequences among the people using that system. This is a picture showing the system from the street level, the normal sort of like hustle and bustle on the streets or boulevards of Paris, and these two systems overhead. Okay, so there was an intense discussion before the decision was made to build this system. I've been reading through a lot of official publications for this great fair, and the following ideas were mentioned. This new system, the double system of the railway and the moving platform, which was proposed by the Mocomble, would be effective because such a system of transportation would be even faster and would actually be able to accommodate more passengers than any train. It was a novelty, so it would seduce visitors and become one of the landmarks of the exposition, which it definitely did. Also, an interesting point was the idea of using an elevated platform, a viaduct, because this way it would be possible to build this system that actually traveled for long distances in the city itself, not in the exposition, without demolishing any buildings or cutting down trees, which would also lead to cost savings. Entrances could be added at will, and the nearest pavilions could be accessed directly from the level of the platform, so on the second floor level. And finally, it was said that the system would reduce visitor fatigue because such huge expositions always have to deal with two sides, huge spaces but short commutes. How to combine huge spaces with shortening the commutes as much possible. And here we saw actually highly successful idea for that. But the system that they built in Paris was anything but new. Ever since the early 1870s, ideas for similar systems had been proposed here and there. So the list of inventors is actually quite long, and this is not a complete list even. So starting from Speer in the United States, and other people came up with ideas in France and Germany and probably other countries as well. And the background for this whole idea definitely was the development of modernity at that time, especially urban developments and the beginnings of the so-called society of the masses. So you all of a sudden had to deal with huge crowds of people that were mixing up with the mess of all new forms of transportation, from omnibuses to streetcars and trains and things like that. So how would these two things merge with each other? Also, city was becoming a place for pedestrians, especially Paris, where the famous concept flaneur started. So people spending time walking on the streets, sitting down at city cafes, just spending time in those new boulevards that the Osmanian system had introduced since the 1870s. So all these things obviously were part of the backdrop for these fantasies and ideas about people moving mechanically on certain kind of prostheses. In fact, the very first person may have been Alfred Speer, who was a wine merchant selling his wares on Broadway in New York. So Speer, who was both a wine merchant and an inventor on the side, saw the developments firsthand in front of his shop, and one day came up with an idea for solving all the traffic problems in the New York City at one stroke. And he was given a patent for what he called improvement in endless traveling sidewalks in 1871. What was Speer's idea? So he wanted to build an elevated platform that would line up the Broadway on both sides. That idea in itself was not absolutely new. Other ideas about layering the city vertically had already been presented, but mostly involving things like trains and things like that. So Speer's idea here was actually now different. And this illustration here gives a much better idea of what Speer actually wanted to do for the city of New York. So his walkway would have been this long loop. We see here one end of the loop. The way the system functioned, as he imagined, is that there would be stations for climbing up from the street level. Once you got up to the waiting platform here, you would be then taken to these kind of speeding little cars. You would actually buy your ticket at the same time while you would actually enter this car. The car would leave like one every minute or something like that, would speed up until it reaches the speed of a moving walkway that we find on the inner side of that system. So once the speed between that car and the walkway is identical, you are sort of like free to step on that platform, and that's where the car would leave you traveling. There would also be moving smoking rooms or ladies' cabins here and there that would be moving along the thing, which would have been handy on rainy weather as well, which happens in New York City quite a lot. So Speer had been doing a lot of thinking on his system, and he was pretty sure that this would be a winner. But the governor turned it down several times, and with always new kinds of excuses. And in the end, Speer's bitter fate was to be a loser. But he remained a successful wine merchant until the end. He also wanted to build a similar system on the other side of the Hudson River, on the New Jersey side, and in the stock certificate that he issued for the company, American Rapid Transit Company, he included an illustration about how he wanted that to be, having become bitter with his efforts to build something on Manhattan by this point. But this system also came to nothing. I will just introduce you one other interesting idea before we see how these things started finally being realized. And this is a system that was called le train continu, or continuous train, that a French inventor and engineer, Eugène Henard, proposed already for the previous World's Fair that took place in 1889. So the one for which the Eiffel Tower became the main symbol. So he would actually do it differently than Speer in New York, in the sense that he wanted to run the continuous train on the ground level, which would make it easy to get on and off. It was supposed to be a free service. You would need no formalities at all for entering and exiting. Unlike Speer's system, where you would actually have those cars moving with conductors and drivers, collecting tickets once you wanted to enter that system. And it had something, as you see soon, curious elevated sections with seats. So the system would essentially be a very strange train, as the title already says, a continuous train moving in a circle. Well, this does not look like any kind of train that we can think about, but if we look at this cross-section, we will understand the idea. Embedded in the system, there would be a circular railway track, and basically the bottom part would be very identical to any railway system. 320 of such railway cars traveling in a continuous circle, and people being able to then step on the platform and move out on the other side whenever they wanted. Now, the system obviously had some problems. especially by the fact that there was nothing like an intermediary platform like we find in the Paris World's Fair in 1900. This is a stationary platform and this is a moving platform. And there were fears that people trying to make the leap directly from the stationary to the fast-moving platform might fall over. The solution that NR wanted to propose was to make this thing stop for 15 seconds every minute. So it would be a kind of an intermediate motion very much. And during those 15 seconds every minute, you would be able to safely jump on the platform until a signal would sound and the continuous train would start moving. If you wanted to see the sides, you could actually climb the stairs up on these very curious looking viewing platforms that were part of that system. Let's look at this system again. So these are the systems that are moving, and there would be a few access points that he was also hoping to put for like continuously for crossing that thing. But the thing is that this seemed to be problematic in many ways and was never built. But what I find interesting is that this idea for circling that exposition ground, which in this case would have circled the Champ de Mars area, was already presented. Now, the trottoir roulant in Paris may be the most famous of all these early installations, but it was not the first realized one. The very first realized one took place in Chicago at the World's Fair that was held in 1893. Now this is part of a bird's eye view of the Chicago World's Fair. And if you look at this pier that sticks quite far into the Lake Michigan, you see a curious looking structure, and that is actually the world's first realized moving walkway. That system was realized by two American engineers whose names were Max Schmidt and Joseph Silsby. And it was based on the patent that I showed you by two German brothers named Rettich, or Rettich probably. This shows you another view of that system. So you have this loop, and then you have the system going to the other end of the pier and coming back the other way. Here you see another view, and also find out that the tickets for the system cost 5 cents. This is a view backwards towards the shore, showing the left side along which these platforms would be returning. And you already see that this system was somewhat different in its idea than those previous ones, in the sense that it had a stationary platform, slow-moving platform, and a fast-moving platform. But the fast-moving platform was really like a train in the sense that it had a continuous sort of like set of rows of seats rather than any standing places. And this was made clear in illustrations. Now, what is interesting when we look at illustrations about the history of technology, they are not necessarily always very reliable, partly because many of these illustrations are created before the actual things ever exist. And for example, this illustration was published already in 1891 with probably just sort of like incomplete information about what this new system at the World's Fair would be. And in this sort of like maybe idealistic version, you see that the system seems to be like somehow moving around the exposition area itself, rather than just being limited on a pier sticking into the sea, into the lake, and sort of like kind of leading nowhere. This is another illustration that is supposedly actually photographed. That's supposedly photogravure, actually, really. supposedly showing that actual installation, but I believe that it shows some kind of a testing track for that system, because what you see around it doesn't match anything in the Chicago World's Fair. But the main point here was that this was more like an amusement ride, a kind of a thrill, rather than anything practical, because you couldn't actually get anywhere really. So the only practical issue was that some people took boats along the lake to enter the exhibition, and those people could potentially take this system back along that long pier. But other than that, there was not huge amount of things to see around it or anywhere to go. So the system was basically just a kind of a demonstrational loop on the edge of the exposition. The same people installed only a short one, a 500-meter long track, already at the Berlin exhibition called Berlin Trade Exhibition, Berliner Gewerbeausstellung in 1896. But it didn't get terribly much attention, even though it linked two amusement sites within that exhibition. Okay, after that little excursion to the back in time, so let's now look at the trottoir roulant in Paris a little bit more in detail, and try to see if we can answer these three questions. First of all, how was the trottoir roulant received by the contemporaries? What kinds of products and discursive formations did it inspire? And finally, was it a success? And this is the point that takes a little bit of a research, because much of the material, as in this kind of a history of technology, cultural historical research, is really split in fragments here and there. So let's see what I can tell you about these things. First of all, there was sheet music. This tune very likely for the first time for more than 100 years. My friend, famous pianist Madame Blavatsky, played it for me yesterday. And this, I happened to find it in an archive, this sheet music inspired by the trottoir roulant for this composition by Dargain. And I like the cover showing this lady leaning on the railing of the platform, even though I haven't been able to figure out if any of these railings were actually moving. I would say that this is slightly wrong in the sense that her position implies fast motion, but the railings probably were stationary. So this actual thing might not have been possible on the trottoir roulant. There were, as often, all kinds of products inspired by this device. And this is the game machine Jeu de Trottoir Roulant, published in 2 different versions in that year already as a souvenir. What happened here is pretty interesting, because this is a certain kind of in the form of a traditional lottery machine. So the shape here does not reproduce at all the lengthy loop of the trottoir roulant. Instead, it sort of like resorts to traditional models where you would actually use a stick to put these things in motion, and based on your figure, you would then be the winner or the loser. This kind of competition was not really part of the experience of moving on the trottoir roulant. But other toy makers also wanted to, get their share of this success. And this is another example. This is a board game where you basically, in a traditional way, are supposed to kind of throw a dice and make progress on the moving walkway. And what it shows, what we could talk about much more, is the variety of cultures present at the World's Fair. And these people probably in many cases would have been ethnic nationals brought on display, but that obviously had some, or may have had some possibilities of trying the moving walkway on their spare time. So rather than being visitors from all these countries, these would have been people on display at the colonial exposition of the World's Fair and placed here within the sort of like the world of the board game. There's an interesting detail that I would like to point out here. This lady showing a menu and trying to persuade the player to spend time in this bouillon restaurant that she represents. She is dressed in the traditional dress of the Duval Bouillon chain of restaurants in Paris at that time that offered very famous soup, and so which makes you ask this interesting question whether advertising on the trottoir roulant would have been allowed or would have ever taken place, or whether it is just a feature that we find in the imagination of the game designer. That's something that I haven't been able to figure out, but Duval Bouillon Duval had a huge restaurant by the riverside on the other side, so it would have been basically easy to just get off from the moving walkway, cross the river, and go and have a delicious bowl of soup. There are many illustrations about the experience on the trottoir roulant. The issue is, as always, what can we say of these illustrations? How much evidence do they condense? Typically, we see almost like panic-like motion, but also combined with excitement. I have collected these quite a lot from different sources, and I'm not going to comment on them here. Things get interesting when you actually start finding photographs, snapshot photographs taken on the trottoir roulant, and not just the kind of pictures that we have already seen, but pictures which show agitated action taking place. By the way, this guy is a kind of a guard or helper. There were actually many of them used with the task of helping people cross from one track to another without falling. Here in this photo, as you can see, we see obviously perhaps a genuine situation with that lady trying to cross from the slow-moving platform to the fast-moving platform with certain problems. In this picture, obviously something similar is happening, and this boy is being held by one of those guards right here, and there's a crowd of people in fast motion. These pictures have been taken by famous travel lecturer Burton Holmes, who visited American travel lecturer who visited the show to find visual material for his magic lantern lectures that he gave about the Paris World's Fair 1900. This is another picture by Burton Holmes, which shows a situation that was often described in the comments about the World's Fair. A kind of a panicky moment where a person being uncertain about this move would actually be holding two of these sticks at the same time, moving at different speeds. And there was a lot of funny stories about people being torn into two because in their panicky moment they wouldn't let out of any. So this was a moment where the guards would have to interfere. Now, interestingly, we have one of those movies from Edison which gives us some evidence about how this kind of more sort of like agitated motion may have taken place. So this is another one. You haven't seen this. Because in this case, you see the camera is stationary while the platforms are in motion. And here obviously the attention is on people's behaviors. There are a few curious moments that you will see soon. Maybe these boys are the school, probably schoolboys' uniforms, I would say. So you actually see some people jumping, possibly posing for the camera, like this guy here. And the boys. So I think that this particular film sequence is interesting because it gives maybe some hints about the actuality of those still pictures and illustrations, pointing out those certain kind of sort of like panicky moments. We don't see such panic taking place here in the film at all, but we see a lot of agitated motions and which I find quite interesting. There were many interpretations, including by comic artists. For example, the three platforms were related with the 3 ages of man, which obviously may have reflected some observations this artist may have done. There was another cartoon which was particularly interesting because it linked the medium of photography, or in this case amateur photography, with the thing. Actually, only handheld cameras were allowed at the World's Fair. You had to pay an extremely high price to be allowed to take photos with a tripod. So that basically also explains this issue of handheld photography. But here we deal in an interestingly complex way with the relationship between motion and the necessity of stopping, stillness, and then obviously leading to a catastrophe when the photographer, who's finally been able to stop these people on the stationary platform, accidentally steps on the moving platform, which obviously destroys what he was trying to do. There is an interesting tradition of illustrations and stories that seems to be claiming that many accidents took place. This is one of them in a British way called a slight mishap on the moving platform, showing an old lady who's fallen on the slow-moving, somehow on the slow-moving platform. This is the stationary platform, by a little girl joyfully plays with one of those these poles, which is part of the moving platform. Here you see one of those guards helping this beautiful lady to step back from the fast-moving platform here, and so on. Here is another illustration showing this lady in is it a Dutch, some traditional dress, completely unable to deal with these moving platforms, being between the fast-moving and slow-moving platform, as obviously her husband panicked on the stationary platform, looks over and shakes his umbrella. So, and this is probably the most dramatic of all these pictures, and this was published in a very handsome publication, a book of photographs documenting the whole World's Fair. And this was the final picture of that book, which I find rather curious here, especially looking at checking the fact that this poor lady is probably going to die in a fraction of a second, hitting her head in the railing, and the guy has no way of helping. At the back, this other lady has a hearty laugh at the misfortune of that other lady, and while this lady gracefully jumps on the moving platform. So she's just going to fall on the stationary platform right here. And other people just spend their times without paying it any attention. Now it doesn't take much to notice that this is a photo montage. Obviously some of these people have been shot in studios and then cut later and added to the photograph to add motion. Obviously some of these figures may have been part of the original photograph. So obviously here somehow even this official publication wants to emphasize this thrill of danger. Danger that is obviously, in this case, this is the most extreme moment that I have seen, but in most cases it's not it's danger that is more like a thrill rather than something really terribly serious. This is the publication from which that was taken, called Le Panorama. This also leads us to the fact that it was not only the platform that the people were fascinated with, but of course also what they saw from the platform. Because after all, this platform, moving platform that was, like I mentioned, more than 3 kilometers long, covered much of the city and managed to give views of many of the pavilions of the exhibition as well. Here, for example, we are turning just from the river bank towards the Champ de Mars. There's the Eiffel Tower, and this is the pavilion called the Tour du Monde, a very important panoramic exhibit by Louis Dumoulin, the marine painter for the French Marine Ministry. And indeed, the view was often compared with the panorama. An engineer said, the aerial disposition of the viaduct permits a complete tour of the exposition and furnishes travelers with extremely varied panoramic views. Now, where this idea comes from, we can find out by looking at pictures from traditional panoramas. So panorama, which is a 360-degree immersive environment, where people are standing in the middle, central part on a viewing platform, often leaning on a railing and looking at paintings, illusionistic paintings surrounding them. So this idea, which was very deeply internalized by the 19th century people, obviously influenced the way how people made sense of what they saw from the trottoir roulant. In a way, the city itself took the place of the painting. So we are actually viewing a city from a panoramic viewing platform. There would be other comments as well. But this panorama was different in the sense that because the platform was in motion, it sort of like gave the impression that the city itself was moving. So it is linked to the topic which is called the Moving Panorama, about which I've written my most recent book. It's coming out in December. So people moving, traveling on that walkway, and this is what one of the guidebooks had to say. This arrangement has the double advantage of allowing visitors, active or otherwise, to pass successively from the stationary point to the maximum speed, and either to admire from the top of the balcony the details of the panorama offered to their eyes, or to reach as quickly as possible any part of the circuit. So pointing out the two aspects, going from place to place or just admiring the panorama offered to their eyes. However, there were different kinds of, shall we say, more perverse panoramas also available, which we can already see in a way in this picture, because if we point out the fact that for much of that track, the trottoir roulant was actually just traveling along city streets, and in some cases it was built very close to the existing buildings because of the, and so this basically means that there were situations where, as Burton Holmes mentioned, it opens new and tempting opportunities for flirtatious Frenchmen. So there's this whole tradition of thinking where that the people actually enjoyed peeping inside people's apartments. And not only that, but others enjoyed exhibiting themselves for the crowds passing by on the trottoir roulant. In this satirical, delightful book called Journal d'un nègre à l'Exposition de 1900, the diary of a black man at the exposition of 1900, supposedly a black man is visiting the exposition and laughing at all the crazy things that the normal Parisians do. There's an illustration showing people on the moving platform. You look at the stick here, moving past this people's window, and she is obviously not fully clothed. This topic keeps on coming back in very interesting ways. This is what the Bergeret, who wrote that book, had to say. He was very pleased with the trottoir roulant because it gave visitors with no acquaintances in the city an opportunity to peek into the apartments of the Parisians and to get familiar with their habits. He regretted that so many unpatriotic inhabitants in a spirit of defiance kept their windows closed during the Walkway's operating hours. It would be interesting to know more. This is what Burton Holmes saw in one window, captioning his picture, Vexen smiles. But obviously what seems to be a woman, or perhaps even a mundane, exhibiting herself is actually a two-dimensional advertising cutout figure for Appareil Gim hardware shop. So obviously some people used this well-known possibility for other purposes as well. There's also a wonderful play written by, at that point, the famous, well-known playwright whose name was Georges Courteline, called Article 330, where the idea is that more than several thousand of people have sort of like summoned the protagonist to court for showing his bare buttocks from his window to the people traveling outside on the moving platform. And his argument was that these people on the platform had not only commented on his apartment in a contemptuous way, but they had thrown in cherry stones, peanuts, olives, and pumpkin seeds from the platform itself, which is why he felt that he had right to respond by his bare back part. The American ambassador in Paris obviously got tired of giving so many speeches during the exposition itself, and is said to have quipped, "Why not prepare one speech and deliver it in a continuous burst of eloquence from the platform mobile?" Which would be an interesting idea about this kind of collective speech. Now, let's see then what was the final balance. So, was this thing a success? It definitely got a lot of attention. Before the exhibition opened, it was calculated that this system could transport altogether 96 million passengers during the 199 days that the World's Fair remained open. The result was not quite so. Just about 6.5 million full-price tickets were sold. The company made a heavy loss, and all the shareholders lost about 55% of their initial investment. And there was a huge loss for the trottoir roulant, especially. The train did a little bit better, actually. But the system didn't have any major problems. There were 43 incidents altogether reported, which is very little even compared with this figure of 6.5 million people traveling on it, on the system. And there were only 2 cases in which fractures were said to suffered by elderly people of all the people who tried the system. So the question is, was it a success or failure? And the answer is yes and no. Financially, it failed, but it was a great success in terms of publicity for the World's Fair, and it seems like the great majority of people really enjoyed that. But it probably was a too big investment, and another problem may have been asking a fee. So the fact that you had to pay a ticket definitely must have limited the number of people using it a lot. So the ticket was actually expensive because this ticket cost as much as a typical ticket to the whole exposition itself. So most people probably tried it once or twice instead of several times. Also, we could say that maybe the discourse on accidents attracted rather than throw people away. Anyway, the Parisians were very happy and interested already in things like montagne russe, which was the early form of the roller coaster that were installed in Paris at that time. And in fact, actually, the electric railway here was a bit like Russian mountains because all the stations were on the ground level and it went up and down, unlike the moving platform, which was just kind of on the equal level. So huge publicity. Also the question about physical exercise. Did it give Parisians better physical conditions and health? Maybe for some. Did it help mixing of cultures? Yes, but within the limits set by the Universal Exposition. And that probably means that people did not necessarily that much come to sort of like meet each other, but at least you could see people of different cultures, even though they may have been mostly exhibits rather than visitors of the exposition itself. Now, about the physical side, this slightly obese man explains that his doctor has ordered him exercise to do about 20 kilometers of exercise per day to lose a little bit of weight. As they say, well, je m'installe ici pour le faire, c'est moins fatigant. So I have installed myself here to do it a few times because it's less fatiguing, you know, this whole idea. And he is actually using a folding chair that he could rent for the enormous price of 2 francs for the moving walkway. Very few were ever rented because it was so expensive. And I come now, if you still have a little bit of energy left, to the conclusion of my talk. So walking with the walking road, but into what kind of a future? And I'm just going to go this ending quickly, but so that you can see the context. Now, when people around 1900 imagined the future, for example, the distant future of year 2000, this idea about the moving walkway was often part of that fantasy. Obviously, because they were much talked about exactly at that moment. There were practical plans, for example, for the New York subway to do certain kind of vertical link lines, for example, between the Penn Station and the Grand Central Station, using this kind of systems that came from the system that Schmidt and Silsby had used at the Chicago World's Fair with continuously moving seats, and then this slow moving platform on the side. Even though there was much discussion about this idea, little or nothing happened. Instead, the building of the subway system with trains went on. Alfred Speer, the pioneer, died in February 17, 1910, and his obituary in the New York Times said, his greatest invention was a traveling sidewalk, the first practical device for rapid transit in New York. His device, of which he had a working model, was favorably received and had the support of Peter Cooper, the founder of Cooper Union, Horace Greeley, and others. An act authorizing its use in New York passed the legislature in 1873 and 74, but was each time vetoed by Governor John A. Dix. After the defeat of his pet project, Mr. Speer turned his attention to his wine business, which he carried successfully until his death. But these ideas kept on coming. This is a proposal for Atlanta from the 1920s, often based on the idea that the city would be built on various different layers, and part of these fantasies was always the moving platforms for pedestrians. Even in Paris, this idea was not forgotten, and in the 1920s, a new plan was made for redesigning the traffic systems in the city. Of course, the Parisian underground metro was already making a lot of progress, but the idea was that in addition to metro, there would be this kind of moving walkway tunnels that would sort of like in a way accompany the metro, like here on near the opera. But of course, the question is that maybe the society was getting even faster. This was the so-called dromological society that Paul Virilio has written about. So maybe there was no need anymore for this kind of systems, because nobody would have time to sort of like travel in such a way when they could just take a few steps and take the subway train and get to their destination much quicker. Maybe this idea would still have made sense 50 years before, when the general speed of culture was much slower. So this idea did not go anywhere. We could look at many other applications, but let's look at these things later. At the New York World's Fair 1939, the famous industrial designer Norman Bell Geddes came up with a radical design for the General Motors pavilion, where he actually took some elements of the earlier moving walkways, which means the seats, but turning them sideways and having a continuous belt travel all across the pavilion. And from those seats, the people could actually, in a way, travel around the central exhibit, which was a vision of a world in 1960, a world completely crossed by freeways, just like Los Angeles came to be. When they got out, they ended up in this kind of cross-section with life-size cars being on the upper level, but no moving walkway here. That idea was proposed by Goodyear Company in 1956 as a solution to entering stadiums, for example. And they also made a new proposal for travel commute between Grand Central Station and Times Square in the future. And amazingly, it looks very much like Max Smith's idea from the beginning of the century, the one that was not realized. And the same fate came to this plan for Goodyear. There were many science fiction writers who wrote about these ideas and fantasized about their possibilities. Most importantly, Robert Heinlein's short story, The Roads Must Roll, which is a vision of a society where the roads, highways have been completely automated. It's the roads that move rather than people on the roads. And that is the background for that story that he weaves around it. Asimov and Clarke and Wells and others. So it also came up in the Jetsons animation series in the 60s. But once again, against the background that I've been trying to sketch for you, we should maybe ask whether this is really a retro-futuristic vision now, in the sense that there is so much work that had already been done for about 100 years, work out of which most things had been left unrealized. And this brings me to my final picture, which is a moving walkway in the Shanghai Aquarium that's in use right there, right at the moment. And we could perhaps ask the question, has the future of the moving walkway finally arrived? So this idea of the moving walkway trip across the, just kind of like through and under the world of sea, is probably something a little bit different than the ones that we encounter at airports and many other public spaces these days. So those so-called non-places where we hardly pay attention to them at all, which we just use to get one point to another. Okay, so this was just my little sort of like run through of a certain motive of the culture of technology during the past about 150 years. And so I'm just kind of, I know time it's late, but I'm just want to sort of like ask if there's any questions or comments about any topics.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. Yes. Yes. I said, yes. Disneyland, I mean, always had a certain kind of retro aspect. Even if Disneyland was talking about future, there's a certain kind of nostalgia there. You know, nostalgia of the future in a way that sort of like looking at future through its figurations, I think, in the past. And I think that I'm just saying that, suggesting that that might be the element already in the 60s, even though obviously there might be somebody who sees that as a futuristic projection. But the way how I talked about retro futuristic thing is that has to do with the fact that there was a lot of knowledge, a lot of understanding, a lot of cultural memory about these moving walkways, and also many futuristic visions by the time. And these futuristic visions went back all the way to the previous century. So in that sense, I wouldn't be surprised if that is sort of like a kind of a retro-futuristic thing. Just like the Flintstones and the Jetsons were actually sort of like two animation series that in a way reflected each other. Flintstones, the prehistoric society, and Jetsons, the society of the future. But basically there were many links and connections, and they were like a mirroring those each other.
Okay. If people have questions, we need to use the microphone just to record the
Okay.
question.
So Lindsay has here in the middle, Lindsay Ross.
Nikola Tesla developed the AC motor. I believe he worked for the French power company early in his career. Is that right?
Yes, Tesla is considered to be the father of AC, and Tesla was in business with Westinghouse in the United States, and I think he had all kinds of businesses in Europe as well, but I don't remember that basic arrangement. But this was definitely an AC-based system, actually, not a DC system. So Tesla's interest may, and very likely, had something to do with that.
Yeah, the
that
French might have felt that they had a stake in Tesla's success.
Probably,
Yeah.
and that's it's an important thing to kind of figure out.
Another thought I had was seeing Parisian dandies on this rolling promenade made me think of the concept of the roué, and in English, the rounder. And that's derived from the concept that boys like them should have been broken on the wheel. Instead,
Yes.
it came out that the wheel was rolling under them. So in a sense, they won.
Mhm.
Society lost and the dandies won.
There are many. That's an interesting point. There would be many other interesting things to figure out, especially in relation to the street culture and the certain kind of physiological types of the city that were much talked about in the 19th century. So, like typifying certain kind of characters in the Paris that had a presence in the boulevards and in the arcades and places like that. So, the issue is really that. Is the something that people don't necessarily always see. It is the has to do with the limitations of the source material. Even for this research that I showed you, I have done a lot of detective work to trying to trace these fragments of these histories. They are not easy to find, so much of it is hidden here and there. I'm sure that I've been trying to find novels that, for example, comment on the World's Fair experience, and all kinds of poems and cartoons and pictures, and I'm sure there's much that I haven't found, but there's strangely not that much that make that kind of links and connections, like with street types and so I mean that this basic issue about how did the typical life forms that you could find from the cities in Paris, boulevards, but also other types of streets, how were they transferred to this new type of city, new type of street experience, which was the one that was actually moving above your heads right through the city. How did those translate to that world? Did it really happen so, or did this thing sort of like try to create new categories? There are some indications that prostitutes, for example, that were a very important group of people in Paris at that time, in many ways kind of used this to their advantage. And obviously that example I showed from Burton Holmes, this advertising display, reflected some things that really actually took place. So people would be advertising themselves in the windows. Prostitutes also looked for clients at the World's Fair in many different parts of that. That's a known fact, you know, and so on. But I mean that how did this new element of the city relate with the existing practices of urban life? How can we find out about that? I think it's a really interesting question. Do we have any? Yes, at the back. So this is, by the way, broomstick.
What is the main reason that a walking sideway couldn't establish, in your opinion, like in urban space?
This is it's actually a big, and I think it's a very important, interesting question. I mean that I don't think there is one single general answer that would fit all, because many ideas are kind of like, there are many interesting ideas to change the urban space. Let me answer a little bit differently. So in 1980, two media artists whose name were Kit Galloway and Sherry Rabinowitz set up an experimental two-way communication link between a shop window in Century City and the Lincoln Center in New York, which was kind of a completely open channel. You could just go there. There's a video camera that would and a microwave. I think it was a kind of microwave and satellite hookup link connecting these two cities. And it was up for 3 days. and worked wonderfully and perfectly, you know, as a sort of like way of communicating between people on the West Coast and East Coast, people who had often hadn't seen each other for a long time, and it also led to kind of interesting sort of like spontaneous sort of like almost like performance forms, telematically. It's called telematic art, and I think that leads to kind of a bit similar questions. I mean that, in some sense, that might be a wonderful medium to exist as a permanent channel of communication. But obviously the financial considerations is one. Who wants to put that much permanent satellite time without any sort of like financial return for that idea? I'm sure that economic issues and calculations have played an important role in the fact that these things haven't succeeded that well, and of course also technical things. You know, it needs to have a infrastructure for maintaining those things. So obviously these successful ones are at places like airports and things where the motivation is mostly practical, or places like Disneyland, so theme parks, amusement parks, where there is a certain kind of like a infrastructure to take care of those things, and obviously an important need like airport. You know, the most amazing ones are at the old Paris airport, at the satellite, so the Terminal 1, where they actually go like this, not straight like this, to the gates. So that's one issue. I could imagine that, for example, this, like I mentioned, that this one at the Paris World's Fair would have been a super great success if you wouldn't have had to pay for that. So that's one thing. But then, of course, that would have emphasized the practical side, because I'm sure that people get tired of everything, you know, new. So the thrill of all these jumping things, and even the thrill of these accidents that people may have even wanted to see, wondering, oh, I wonder if I'll see a dramatic accident or whatever is possible. That thrill probably would have little by little evaporated, you know, when things become part of the everyday normal experience. Do you have any idea why it wouldn't have developed further?
My idea is that you can't really adjust it to the demand of people needing it, because it has to run at the same speed all the time, while with a bus you can simply run less buses. So yeah, that's my idea. It doesn't really seem very energy efficient.
I think it's an element. Anyone has another? Yes. Can you bring the microphone here?
Can you talk a little bit more about the moving walkway as being evidence of a kind of transformation of perception into this audio-visual vehicle?
That's another lecture. I have actually such a lecture on my laptop, but I obviously can't give it right now. But I mean that in connection with media culture, the moving walkway is connected with various trends in mobility. I actually showed one picture of the panorama. Just the panorama was one element of that. So where the experience of perception, when you're in a 360-degree illusionistic environment, is obviously something that is connected with mobility. So which means you have to walk, you have to turn, you have to use your physical body to experience that media. And that's a very different situation from, let's say, like a traditional cinema experience, where basically the only part of the body which is really activated are your eyes and your ears. But the rest of the body, much of the time, remains in a stationary position. So there is a whole sort of like media archaeology to be written from the point of view of the mobile spectator and mobile spectatorship. That idea. It starts becoming important in the 19th century, little by little, Diorama was another system where the audience was put on a mobile platform. So the platform would just be turning from one picture to another, but on there was a circular auditorium. So like some theaters have that kind of things as well. So it's part of the so-called rotating architecture. So that rotating architecture, that's a much bigger tradition than most people think. So buildings or structures that move mechanically, and that mechanical movement is often linked with perceptual changes. So visual media experiences. So I think that is one element. So in this case, obviously the media aspect is only one part of that experience of the moving walkway, and most clearly in this comparisons between this experience and the panorama. So seeing the city as if was a painted picture in a panorama system. Obviously, this link these days have to be also rethought in these new links between flaneur. Flaneur was the idea about the loiterer, the person just kind of like using the city streets as his living room and just spending time on the streets and cafes and things. These days we have phoneur and we have driver. Driver means person driving a car and using a mobile phone to connect, which is not very allowed in this country. And phoneur. Phoneur is a new form of flaneur. Phoneur is what you see on the campus every day. These guys walking and typing text messages or looking at their screens. This is a kind of a flaneur, but it's now called phoneur. Téléphone, phoneur. So this whole idea about from flaneur, phoneur, driver is part of that history as well. I can't imagine that what would have happened if people had those iPhones on the trottoir roulant. The 42 casualties or whatever problems might have been 4,200, or more, because it needed a little bit of attention to something else than a screen that you're holding in your hand, Anyway, to sort of like handle that system. Yes.
Well, the next big thing also came out of the Chicago Exposition, one in 1934, where they had, in the way of a continuous moving belt, the General Motors Pavilion there had an actual assembly line where they built Chevrolets.
Yes.
Yeah, another thought I had was one of your early slides showed these stainless steel modern moving sidewalks at the French airport. Reminded me of the woman Temple Grandin, who creates cattle chutes for to passivate cattle on their way to slaughter.
This is another really interesting issue that also sort of like gives another framework for that whole thing, and so this whole archaeology of the conveyor belt or assembly line and that kind of things. Obviously, this is a kind of a conveyor belt as well. This does not convey parts of Ford T-model Ford parts, but it conveys human beings. It doesn't convey beef to be slaughtered and turned into sausage like Cincinnati and Chicago slaughterhouses did already in the decades before the Paris World's Fair. But it is related with those experiences. So this idea about things that run continuously on a belt and things happen by the belt or on the belt or whatever. This is also related with another study that I've been working on, which is about this rotating sushi bars or the kaiten sushi, which I'm looking in this paper, which is not quite ready, but almost, about the rotating sushi bar as a manifestation of this kind of technological culture and the culture of the assembly line and conveyor belt. and how that sort of like links with those ideas. There's an amazing amount of varieties of those rotating sushi bars these days. I do a lot of research on that practically in Japan. Luckily, I love sushi, so even though the sushi is not the greatest in many of these rotating sushi bars, but sometimes good enough. So that's another link. Factory assembly lines, demonstrational assembly lines in these things. Because you mentioned that thing, so I think I said in the beginning that I don't know quite what this research is going to be in the end, but I have written a few studies that probably might link with each other to a kind of an archaeology of the public space in terms of these technical and mediatic experiences. So this may well become part of that, and there's quite a lot about those conveyor belt systems as well in that thing, I believe. Yes.
So I was interested in this idea of different groups of people coming together on the moving walkway, even if it may have been staged initially. Do you think that there is still potential for the moving walkway to create new kinds of social interaction?
I very rarely see any of that happening, except that people are frustrated when some people decide to stand on the moving walkway while many others want to walk, and this mostly happens at airports. As far back as I try to think, I haven't seen any example at all of sort of like a new kind of social interactions, except in a negative sense, people bumping into each other on those walkways that I have been trying. And that has to do with this idea I mentioned, Marc Auger's idea about non-space, which is these kind of liminal spaces that we now have, where you don't really want to be. You just cross those spaces because you need to get from one place to another. Airport itself is a kind of a liminal space. Very few people would like to spend time at the airport if they could choose. They just go there because they need to go someplace, and maybe they use some services there while they are waiting, that kind of things. But very few people would go to an airport just to experience the airport these days. Maybe some big fans, hardcore fans, and that kind of things. But so that issue about those nationalities on the moving walkway, it is an interesting question. So it's in this Paris World's Fair. It's exactly quite difficult to tell to what extent these things are staged. I have seen photographs where there are so-called ethnic types, non-Western ethnic types on the moving walkway. And the most likely explanation is really that quite a few of these kind of so-called natives were brought to Paris to perform at these colonial pavilions. And Tour du Monde, I mentioned the Panorama Tour du Monde, had all these so-called natives performing in front of panorama canvases all through the exhibition, like including 12 Japanese geisha girls that were bought from Japan just for that purpose. And definitely those geisha girls had some time off. They spent several months of their life basically just inside the World's Fair. And in those days, in those times off, I'm sure they took the moving walkway and experienced that, went to some theaters and whatever, all kinds of things. Sometimes they were snapped by a photograph because it's an exotic topic and that kind of things. So it is difficult to say exactly how much it is, how much of it is really staged, how much happens because of that general context within which we operate. I wish I could be more certain, but like I'm saying, so this kind of research really works with fragments and fragments and fragments, and you have to try to put them together and make sense out of those. So but it's an interesting point. interesting question to think about. But these days, I don't see moving walkway as anything sort of like thrilling at all. Maybe the one at the Shanghai Aquarium, for example, where you actually go. So the issue, the big change from the model in Paris to those later ones was, of course, that in Paris you had much to see from the walkway. And that would have worked even if that structure had remained after the World's Fair was over. But there was so much negative critique as well, especially from these people who felt that they are being spied and peeked at by those people, abused in a way. So people felt that their rights were violated by the system. So there was this issue about privacy versus this kind of a new public visibility of this modern city. That was an element, I think, in the failure as well. At least in the way it was installed in Paris.
I'm wondering whether it makes a difference that the walkway is motorized or not. Because, I mean, the same structure in Paris, if people would have walked, they still would have had all these views. They could have changed the speed themselves.
There's a really wonderful this kind of walkway in Paris now. So like behind the Gare de Lyon, so like behind Bastille, it's an old aqueduct which has been turned into this kind of like a garden-like walkway through the city. So you can go up. Now you have escalators actually going up, and then you have benches there. You go jogging and you can enjoy some greenery, that kind of things. It doesn't obviously have moving walkway there, but that place functions in the same way right now. I just tried it last year, and it is separated from the city, but it's still in the middle of the city. It has several access points to go down, that kind of thing. So that's a good question. I mean, to what extent? I mean, obviously, there's slightly speeded up, like movement is an element, but how important that is, it's a good question.
The reason why I asked is because I was recently on the High Line in New York, which in a way
that's
has
another.
been a train and now is a public garden, and you get all these aspects of you see into people's homes, people sort of. I mean, people want to live next to the highway now. There's new developments, and people really live openly. I mean, you really see how they live. You see their living rooms.
Yes.
They appear in magazines. I mean, you get all these aspects. But
that's right.
It's just walking.
It is. It's an element, and I mean that we could also think about the elevated in Chicago, which I think is part of this whole thing. That in a way it's a nuisance for people living nearby. Because it's actually also noisy. So with these systems, a lot of, by the way, effort was made already. The Spear, in his patent, described that he would use rubber coatings and things like that to make that system as noiseless as possible. That thing that he wanted to build in around Broadway. So, yeah, it's a good question. I think that these days maybe one argument is that because we are living in this tromological society where everything is very busy, so those refunctionalized kind of elevated railways and viaducts and things like that can be a kind of a counterpoint. That if you want to escape from that sort of like a kind of like crazy busy life on the street level, you go up there. And maybe the argument wasn't quite the same at the 1900 World's Fair. But definitely those places, I think, I haven't actually been there, but next time when I'm in New York, I need to go and throw a few beans behave badly and see if anybody will show me a bare bottom.
It's really nice. I mean, one thing that comes to mind right now is there's a sort of a cinema where you can sit down on the side of the garden and you just watch. There's like a framed piece of the street, so you just watch the street as if it was a movie. I mean that the panorama thing. So
it's something to think about.
It's nicely done.
So it's a good way of linking it to the present. I think Yoshitaka has a question.
I'm curious about the speed of the rotating, and how was it decided, and, or is it based on the physiology?
Yeah, I think that's always a kind of a good question. I mean, how to decide the actual speed with these systems, because I guess that you have to define a fine line between things being too slow and boring and then too fast and dangerous, really. So I think that for all these systems that I showed, they developed a kind of a testing line where they tried out different speeds, you know, with just simply test subjects and that kind of thing. So, but it's a little bit difficult probably to say how they came up with that final speed, for example, for the system in Paris. I'm sure there was it was partly based on intense testing and things that was. So the fast track was about, so basically 100% faster than the one in the middle. So double the speed. So that was the idea. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't seen any sort of like a test footage about the testing itself, but probably some experience says. By the way, another issue is that some of these pictures that I have seen about this moving walkway show people with bicycles up there on the moving walkway, so which is kind of like a crazy. But I believe that they must have been some special stunts or special occasions. I don't think they would have allowed bicycles up there when it's already kind of difficult to. I wonder if roller skates or like whatever would have happened, you know. Because you saw how by the way, how that structure moves, because there are curves. There's this kind of like a round piece which helps the system to kind of curve. It's quite nice. But I don't really know how those things were decided. It's easier to do research in the sushi bars, rotating sushi bars, defining the perfect ultimate speed with which that piece of sushi needs to come to your place. Because I know that, you know, sometimes it's too fast, so that all the good pieces pass you if you are chatting with someone. Sometimes it's so slow that everyone else will get the good things before you get that, you know, that kind of things. I think it's based on client testing with clients or so. Okay, maybe we should. It must be already close to midnight, 2 o'clock. Okay, so thanks. I hope there was something interesting in this talk. Okay, thank you.